The morning Violet Langley posted the notice in the window of Garrison's General Store in Abilene, Kansas. She had already been turned down by 4 men who thought a woman traveling alone to Santa Fe, New Mexico was either foolish, desperate, or both. It was the spring of 1874, and the Kishom Trail was still thick with cattle drives and outlaws, and the long stretch of land between Abilene and the territory to the south and west was no place for a woman without protection. Violet knew this. She had known it when she packed her trunk, when she sold her father's pocket watch to afford the supplies, and when she stood at the edge of town at dawn and stared at the horizon like it owed her something. She knew the danger. She was going anyway. The notice read simply, "Escort needed. Santa Fe bound. Good pay. Inquire at room 4, the Drover's Inn." Violet sat in that room for 2 days. 3 men came. One smelled of whiskey so strongly she could taste it when he opened the door. The second looked her over in a way that made her stomach turn, and she sent him out before he had finished his first sentence. The third was polite enough, but when she explained the route she intended to take, through Dodge City and then southwest into New Mexico, he laughed outright and told her it was suicide for a woman traveling light. She thanked him and closed the door in his face. On the morning of the 3rd day, someone knocked. She called out that the door was open, and when it swung inward, the man who stepped through it was not at all what she had expected. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with a quietness about him that the room seemed to absorb rather than resist. His hat was worn and dark brown, his coat well used but clean, and his eyes were the color of creek water in autumn, somewhere between green and gray, watching her without any of the calculation she had grown used to seeing in men's faces when they looked at her. He said his name was Amos Hawkins. He said he had seen her notice. He asked if she was still looking. She told him to sit down and asked him what qualified him for the job. He took the chair across from her without ceremony and told her plainly. He had been a scout for the Union Pacific Railroad for 3 years, before the rails went too far west for scouting to matter. Before that he had guided 2 separate wagon trains from Missouri to Oregon, both arriving without significant loss of life. He knew the terrain between Abilene and Santa Fe as well as he knew his own hands. He had dealt with outlaws, hostile weather, river crossings, and every variety of trail hardship that existed between the Missouri border and the Rio Grande. He was 28 years old, in full health, and he did not drink. Violet studied him while he spoke. He was not a man who oversold himself. There was no performance in his recitation, no attempt to impress her. He stated facts the way a man might describe the weather, simply and without decoration. She asked him what he wanted for the job. He named a figure that was fair but not greedy, and when she nodded, he did not press her for more. She told him she would be leaving in 4 days, that she had a wagon with 1 horse and required a second mount, and that her destination was a homestead 20 miles east of Santa Fe where her older sister had written to say she was ill and needed help. He nodded and asked if she had the supplies she needed. She said most of them. He stood, put his hat back on, and said he would see to the rest and meet her at the eastern edge of town before dawn on Thursday morning. He was there when she arrived, before the sun had broken the horizon. He had the horses watered and the wagon checked over, had replaced a cracked spoke in the front wheel she had not noticed, and had packed enough dried beef and hardtack and flour to last them 3 weeks. He did not make a show of any of it. He simply had it done when she got there, and that alone told her something about him that his words had not. They left Abilene in the gray dark of early morning, the town still sleeping behind them, the prairie spreading out ahead like a promise the land had not yet decided to keep. The first day out was quiet. Violet drove the wagon and Amos rode alongside on his bay horse, which he called Cedar, though he did not explain why. She did not ask. She had her own way of moving through silence, shaped by years of living with a father who rarely spoke but felt everything. She was comfortable with quiet, and it turned out that Amos Hawkins was the same. By evening they had made good distance, and he chose the campsite with the ease of a man who had done it 1,000 times. setting the wagon with its back to a low ridge that would block the wind, building the fire small and low the way experienced trail hands always did, enough for warmth and cooking, but not so much it announced them to every pair of eyes in the dark. He cooked without being asked. Not elaborate cooking, but competent and warm. A pan of beans with fatback and cornbread baked in the Dutch oven. She ate hungrily and he ate quietly, and afterward he took the first watch without telling her to sleep, just sat himself down near the fire's edge and looked out at the dark as though it were an old companion. She meant to stay awake, to show she was not helpless. She was asleep before the fire had burned down an inch. She woke to the sound of birdsong and the smell of coffee. On the second day she began to talk. She told him about her sister, Clara, who had married a man named Edmund Fitch 3 years ago and moved west with him to start a cattle operation. Edmund had died the previous winter, a fever that went bad, and Clara was left with a small herd, a claim she could not work alone, and 2 young children under the age of 5. Violet had been teaching school in Abilene, a job she had held for 2 years since coming from Indiana, but Clara's letter had been so quietly desperate that Violet had not been able to read it twice without deciding. Amos listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked how old Clara's children were. She told him one was 4 and the other was 2. He said that was young to be without a father. She agreed. He did not say anything else about it, and she appreciated that he did not fill the air with comfort that cost him nothing. By the 3rd day she was asking him questions. Where he was from, whether he had family, how a man ended up knowing the land between Kansas and New Mexico better than most people knew their own houses. He told her he was from Kentucky, originally, born in a farming town outside Lexington. His father had died when he was 16, a work accident involving a horse that went wrong, and his mother had remarried quickly, a man who was decent enough but whose house did not feel like home anymore. At 18, Amos had headed west. He did not say it with bitterness or drama. He said it the way a man describes taking a road because the other one was blocked. He had drifted for a time, working cattle drives, and then finding that he was better at finding routes than driving cattle. He had a sense of the land, a way of reading the sky and the grass, and the way water moved through ground that the Union Pacific had found valuable. After the railroad work dried up, he had taken on escort jobs here and there, usually merchants or surveyors who needed someone to keep them from getting lost or robbed. She asked if he had ever been married. It was a forward question and she knew it, but she asked it anyway because she was not a woman who believed in circling around things. He said no. He said he had come close once, a woman in Wichita, 2 years back. He said it had not worked out, not because of any cruelty, but because she had wanted someone who would stay in one place and he had not yet figured out how to do that. Violet thought about that. She thought about how a person's whole character could be contained in a detail as small as that, the wanting to stay and the not knowing how. She did not tell him yet that she was 25 and had been proposed to twice and refused both times, not because she was opposed to marriage, but because neither man had made her feel that the world would be better for having him in it rather than just more convenient. She had high standards, her father had always said, and he had said it with a kind of pride that made her feel it was a virtue rather than a curse. They crossed into the territory of western Kansas on the 4th day, the land beginning to flatten and stretch in ways that felt both infinite and intimate. The sky was enormous here, more sky than earth, and Violet found herself grateful for it in a way she had not expected. That night, a sound came out of the darkness that made her sit up from her bedroll with her heart knocking against her ribs. It was a low sound, something between a voice and the wind, and for a moment she was not sure whether she had dreamed it. Amos was already standing, his rifle in his hand. He moved without sound to the edge of the firelight and stood there for a long moment. Then he turned and came back and said, quietly, "Coyotes, a big pack of them, moving south along the creek. Nothing to worry about." She said she had not been worried. He looked at her with something in his expression that might have been the beginning of a smile. She noticed the almost smile and looked away. On the 5th day they rode into Dodge City, and the contrast of it, all noise and heat and packed streets and the smell of cattle and human industry, came like a cold wave after the quiet of the trail. Dodge City in 1874 was at the height of its cattle drive era, a town perpetually in the act of becoming something and never quite settling into what that was. The saloons were open and busy before noon. The streets were dust and dung, and the sound of boots on boardwalks. They stopped at a supply store to replenish the water barrels and get fresh grain for the horses. And while Amos was at the livery, Violet took herself to the dry goods store and bought a new pair of gloves to replace the ones she had worn through on the wagon reins. She was at the counter paying when a man came in behind her and stood too close and began speaking at her shoulder in a tone that made the hairs on the back of her neck rise. He was older, thick through the middle, with the particular kind of confidence that belongs to men who believe their size and their loudness give them rights over the world around them. He asked her if she was traveling alone. She said she was traveling with her husband. The word came to her easily, not from any real deception but from a practical understanding of what the world required of a woman in her position. The man looked skeptical. He asked where her husband was. Amos walked through the door. He did not say a word. He simply came in, stood beside Violet in a way that was entirely natural, and put his hand briefly at the small of her back, a gesture so light and so settled that it said everything it needed to without performance. He looked at the man at the counter with an expression that was entirely pleasant and entirely serious at the same time. The man left. Violet finished paying. They walked out together, and when they were back on the street, she said, without looking at him, "Thank you." He said, of course, and that was all, but something had changed in the air between them. Something small and significant, the way a single degree of temperature change can shift an entire season. They left Dodge City that afternoon and headed southwest, the land changing around them as Kansas began its slow surrender to the territory beyond. The grass grew shorter, the rock more present, the wind drier and warmer. Violet began to understand why people describe the West as something that got into you, because she felt it doing exactly that, working its way into her chest, expanding something there. On the evening of the 6th day, they made camp near a shallow creek lined with cottonwood trees, and the golden light of the setting sun came through the leaves in a way that made the whole world feel briefly suspended. Violet unhitched the horse while Amos watered Cedar, and she found herself watching him without intending to, the way he moved with the horse, the ease of it, the way Cedar turned his big head and pressed it against Amos's shoulder the way a dog would. She said, without thinking, "You have been doing this a long time." He looked over at her, and there was something different in his expression, more open, like a door that had been cracked an inch. He said he supposed he had. He asked if that concerned her. She said no. She said it only made her wonder what it would take to make him want to stop. The question surprised even herself. It was too personal, too much like reaching past the professional arrangement they had settled into, and she watched him consider it, his hands stilling on the saddle he was unsettling from Cedar's back. He said he reckoned it would take the right reason. She turned back to her work and did not say anything else. But she felt the sentence sitting with her like a warm coal through the rest of the evening. By the 8th day out of Abilene, they had settled into a rhythm that felt more like two people who had traveled together for years than a woman and her hired escort. She made the coffee in the mornings, having discovered that hers was considerably better than his, which he admitted without embarrassment. He handled the heavier camp tasks and the navigation, and took the night watches, allowing her to sleep in full, because he said he had spent enough years sleeping light that it came to him naturally now. They talked through the days, conversations that started about practical things and wandered into territory that felt increasingly uncharted. She told him about growing up in Indiana, about her father who had been a school teacher and her mother who had died of pneumonia when Violet was 11, and how that had made her both more capable and more solitary than other women she knew. He told her about the 2 wagon trains he had guided west, about the people on them, a Presbyterian minister who had turned out to be the toughest man on the whole trail, a woman in her 60s traveling alone to join her son who had never once complained of anything even when the going was genuinely miserable. He told stories with a natural eye for detail, noticing things. She realized slowly that it was the same quality that made him an extraordinary scout. He did not miss things. He noticed the way she tensed her shoulders when something worried her. He noticed when she ran out of water before she said anything and refilled her canteen. He noticed when the wind changed before it changed, the way the horse's ears moved, the quality of the light. He was a man who watched the world as though it were speaking to him constantly, and he was determined not to miss a word. On the 10th day, the weather turned. The sky went the color of old iron in the early afternoon, a flat, heavy gray that pressed down on the horizon from the north. Amos reined Cedar in and stood looking at it for a long moment without moving. Then he turned to Violet and said they needed to find cover, and there was something different in his voice, not urgency exactly, but the kind of focused seriousness that told her this was not an ordinary change of weather. She asked how bad. He said bad enough. He said there was a bluff formation about 2 miles southwest that he had used before, a natural overhang that could shelter the wagon and the horses if they moved now. They moved. The wind picked up within 20 minutes, carrying grit and a cold that felt wrong for late April, and the sky darkened further until it had the greenish cast that prairie people learned to fear. By the time they reached the bluff, the first rolls of thunder were coming from somewhere behind the northern horizon. He got the horses settled under the overhang first, tying them securely and putting feed down so they would stay calm. Then he helped Violet cover the wagon with the canvas she had packed, working quickly and without wasted motion, and finally pulled her in under the overhang just as the sky opened. It was not a polite rain. It was a Midwestern downpour turned violent by the open land, driving rain with a wind that sent it horizontal, and under the overhang they stood pressed close together because there was not much room, listening to the sound of it, enormous and total, like the whole prairie was being rearranged. She was closer to him than she had been since the moment in Dodge City, and she was aware of it with a physical specificity that she did not quite know what to do with. She was aware of the warmth of him in the cold that the rain had brought. She was aware of how still he was, watching the storm with that same focused attention he gave to everything, as though the storm were simply another kind of information. She said, into the noise of it, that she was glad he had seen it coming. He looked down at her, and in the dim light under the rock she could see his expression clearly, something in his face that was too honest to be professional, something that looked at her and did not try to look away. He said he was glad they were out of it. The storm lasted 2 hours. They did not move or talk much. They stood under the rock while the world was loud and wet and enormous around them, and by the time it began to ease, something had shifted between them again, not crossed, not spoken, but present the way the smell of rain is present after a storm in everything. When the rain stopped, the world was clean and copper-colored in the late light, and Violet stepped out from under the overhang and looked at the sky, which had gone from iron to a deep luminous pink in the west. She heard Amos come out behind her and stop. She turned to look at him, and he was looking at the sky with something in his face that she could not name but recognized, the look of a person who has been moved by something they were not expecting to be moved by. She said quietly, "It is beautiful." He looked at her then, not the sky, and said yes. She turned back to the sunset and they stood in the wet grass until the pink faded to dark, and not one word was necessary. On the 11th day, she found out that the man who had hired him had told him the job would be simple. A woman going to her sister's place, easy terrain, 2 weeks at most. The man who had hired him was the innkeeper at the Drover's Inn, who had taken it upon himself to act as a sort of informal clearinghouse for trail escort work. He had sent Amos the job because, As the innkeeper put it, this particular woman seemed sharp enough to need the best. She found this out because she asked, directly, how he had come to know about her notice when she had not seen him at the inn during the 2 days she waited. He told her all of it simply. He said the innkeeper, a man named Prout, had sent word to the boarding house where Amos stayed between jobs. He said Prout had described her as a schoolteacher, unmarried, heading southwest with purpose and no apparent plan for her own protection. He said he had come to the room the next morning. She asked why he had waited a day. He said he had been finishing a job, a survey crew he had got to the Colorado border. He had ridden hard to get back to Abilene in time. She said, so you were not even in Abilene when the notice went up. He said no, he had not been. She thought about this. She thought about how he had ridden hard to get back, not knowing her, not knowing anything about her except that she was a woman alone needing escort to Santa Fe. She thought about the wheel spoke he had replaced before she arrived at the meeting point on Thursday morning, which meant he had looked the wagon over the evening before in the dark or near it to make sure it was sound. She thought about all of this, and then she asked him, half-testing, whether Prout paid him a finder's fee for jobs. He said no. He said Prout just passed along information. She asked whether the fee she was paying him was the full extent of his compensation. He said yes. He said it was fair pay for the work. She nodded and let the conversation move on to other things, but she filed it away. The way she filed away everything he did that didn't quite add up to the simple arithmetic of a man doing a job for money. She had begun, without entirely meaning to add him up. On the 12th day, they crossed into what would soon become the Oklahoma Territory. Though in 1874 the map still called it Indian Territory, and Amos grew more alert, not in a frightened way but in the way of a man who respects a place and the people who inhabit it. He told her the Comanche were quieter this far east than they had been in previous years, and that they would likely encounter more Kiowa if they encountered anyone, and that his experience with both peoples was that a respectful traveler passing through with no hostile intent was generally left in peace. She asked whether he had spent much time among the tribal peoples of the territory. He said some. He said he had traded with Comanche camps twice during his railroad scouting years, and that once, in a bitter February, he had been taken in by a Kiowa family when a blizzard had caught him alone on the northern plain. He said they had given him warmth and food and asked nothing in return, and that it was an experience he thought about often, particularly when he heard the way people back east talked about the people of these territories as though they were the problem on their own land. He said it quietly but with a firmness that told her it was a considered opinion, not a casual one. She said she thought he was right. She said that the westward movement her country was making, the one she herself was participating in, was built on a foundation of injustice that would cost them all eventually, that the people who had lived on this land for generations had not been asked, had not consented, had had things taken from them that could not be returned, and that the least a person could do was acknowledge that truth rather than dress it up as destiny or progress. He looked at her with a kind of surprised recognition, as though he had not expected to hear his own thoughts reflected back at him. He said, "She is quite something, that schoolteacher from Indiana." She said, "Keep your eyes on the trail, Mr. Hawkins." But she was smiling when she said it, and he heard the smile in her voice, and Cedar seemed to step a little lighter after that. On the 14th day, they ran into trouble. Not the dramatic kind, not outlaws with drawn guns and thundering horses, though Violet had half prepared herself for something like that. The trouble came in the form of a river crossing gone uncertain. The Cimarron was running higher than expected after the storm 4 days earlier, the current faster and murkier, and the ford that Amos had used twice before was deeper by several feet. He spent an hour examining it, riding Cedar through the shallower edges, reading the current, checking the bottom for soft sand that could swallow a wagon wheel. Violet watched him work with the patience of someone who understood that this was not hesitation but care. Finally, he came back and said they had two choices. Push the crossing today carefully, with the wagon lightened as much as possible, or camp here and wait for the river to drop, which might take 2 days or might take 5. She asked which he recommended. He said the crossing, if she was comfortable with it, because the weather from the north had settled and there was no second storm coming that he could read, and waiting meant supplies running tighter for the back half of the trip. She said, "Let us do the crossing." He spent another hour preparing it. He tied extra rope to the wagon's tongue and ran it forward, creating a lead line he could guide from Cedar while she drove. He moved the heaviest supplies to the lowest point of the wagon bed for balance. He checked every piece of harness twice. He explained to her exactly what he needed her to do with the reins during the crossing, how to give the horse its head in the current, but be ready to correct if it swayed. She listened carefully, asked 2 questions, and nodded. The crossing was not easy. The water came up to the wagon bed before they were a third of the way across, and Violet felt the wagon shudder and lean against the current in a way that sent her heart into her throat. But she did what he had told her, and Cedar and the wagon horse both kept their footing, and Amos on Cedar moved steadily ahead with the lead rope taut and sure, guiding them through the worst of the current to where the bottom rose again, and the water shallowed, and then they were on the far bank, the horses blowing and the wagon dripping, and they were across. She sat on the wagon seat for a moment after the crossing and breathed very carefully. Then she climbed down and went to her wagon horse and pressed her forehead against the animal's neck and said "good girl" into her mane. Amos came around the wagon and said she had done well. She lifted her head and looked at him, and he was standing close, checking the harness traces with his hands, his face near hers, and she saw the faint line of tension in his jaw that told her he had been holding breath too, watching her come through. She said, "You were worried." He said, "I am always careful." She said, "That is not what I said." He met her eyes, and for a moment neither of them moved, and the river kept running behind them, and the horses were calm now, and the afternoon light was long and golden, and everything was still. He said, quietly, "Yes, I was worried." She nodded once slowly and stepped back and went to help with the unpacking so they could dry out what had gotten wet. But the word stayed with her. The way he had said it, simply and true, without defense. That evening they made camp on the southern bank of the Cimarron, and the mood between them was different again, warmer and closer, the way a fire gets when you pile more wood on, not dangerous but undeniably present. She made the coffee and he made the food, and they sat across from each other with the fire between them, and she asked him something she had been building up to for days. She asked whether he had taken this job because the pay was good or because the job itself had appealed to him. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, looking at it. Then he looked up at her, and she could see him deciding something in the moment before he answered. He said the pay was fair but not exceptional. He said that other jobs available to him at the time would have paid somewhat better. He said he had taken this one because something about it, about the notice, about what Prude had told him, had made him want to. She asked what specifically. He said Prude had told him she had turned down 3 men before him. He said most women in her position would have taken the first escort willing, out of necessity. He said the fact that she had not, that she had been willing to wait for the right one rather than take anyone, had told him something about her. She asked what it had told him. He said it had told him she was serious, that she knew what she needed and she was not going to accept less. He said that kind of person was worth helping. She looked at him across the fire for a long time. Then she said, "Mr. Hawkins, I think you might be a better man than you know." He looked away then, back at the fire, and she saw the color that moved across his jaw and neck, slight and quick, and it was the most endearing thing she had ever seen on a grown man's face. She let him have the silence after that. She had learned in 2 weeks on the trail with him that he received kindness the way a person who is not used to it does, carefully and with some internal processing that required privacy. She was falling in love with him. She had been aware of it building for days, but sitting here on the south bank of the Cimarron in the spring dark of 1874, She acknowledged it to herself fully. She was falling in love with Amos Hawkins, her hired escort, and she suspected he did not yet know that she had already begun to figure out that he would have taken this job for nothing, that it was not the money driving him across these miles beside her. On the 15th day, the terrain changed dramatically, the Oklahoma Territory giving way to the edge of New Mexico, the land becoming more dramatic, redder and rockier, mesas rising out of the flat like cathedrals built by a more ancient patience than anything human. Violet had never seen anything like it, and she told him so, and for the first time she saw him properly light up, not just a suggestion of feeling but real visible joy, the joy of a person sharing something they love. He pointed out formations and named them, told her how they were made, thousands of years of water cutting through sandstone, patient and total. He told her about the light here, how it changed every hour in ways that made the same rock look like a different country at dawn and noon and dusk. He said he had come through here twice before, and both times it had stopped him in his tracks, the sheer scale of it, the old, indifferent magnificence. She watched him talk about it, and she thought about what he had said about not yet knowing how to stay in one place. She thought about the fact that he loved the land like this, with the reverence of someone for whom it was home in the way that a house cannot be home for everyone. She thought about what it would mean to love someone who loved the open country. She thought that it might mean learning to love the open country too, and looking around at the mesas, at the sky that went on forever, at the particular quality of the light that he had said changed every hour, she thought it might not be so very hard. That night she asked him directly whether he had any plans after this job. He said he had a couple of inquiries waiting, a merchant in Santa Fe who needed someone to take a supply run to Taos, another in Albuquerque looking for a route scout. She said, "So you will stay in New Mexico for a while?" He said he supposed he might. She said, "That is interesting." He looked at her across the small fire, and she could see him turning the sentence over, examining it, and she let him. She said, "My sister's place is 20 miles east of Santa Fe, and I expect to be there for some time, helping her get the operation on its feet." She said Clara's 2 children would need looking after, and the cattle herd would need someone who knew what to do with it, and that she had some ideas about how to manage it but no practical experience with cattle. Amos said, "I spent 2 years on cattle drives before the railroad work." She said she knew that. He had told her on the 3rd day. He looked at her. She looked back at him. The fire crackled between them. He said, "Violet." It was the first time he had used her name without the miss in front of it. She felt it the way you feel the first warm day after a long winter, physically and all at once. She said, "Yes." He said, "Are you suggesting what I think you are suggesting?" She said she thought it would be practical, a man with trail experience and cattle knowledge staying near enough to assist with a failing operation that had 2 small children and no man on the property. He said practical. She said, among other things. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the fire. Then he said, "There is something I should tell you." He said he had known about her situation in more detail than she realized. He said that Prout, the innkeeper, was a distant cousin of Edmund Fitch, her late brother-in-law, and that Prout had told him not just that a woman needed an escort to Santa Fe, but the whole story, about Clara, about the homestead, about the children, about a woman in Abilene who had walked into his inn looking like she had already decided to move mountains and was simply working out the logistics. Violet stared at him. He said, "Prout told me the pay you were offering was half what an escort of this length usually ran." He said, "I took it anyway." She said, "Half." He said, "Roughly." She said, "Amos Hawkins, you took half pay." He said, "The work was worth doing." She was quiet for a long moment. She thought about the wheel spoke. She thought about the 4 days he had ridden hard to get back to Abilene in time. She thought about the crossing of the Cimarron and the storm at the bluff and the coffee every morning and the careful way he had placed the camp every evening to keep the wind off her bedroll. She said, "You would have done it for nothing." He looked at the fire. He did not answer right away, and she let the silence sit between them because she already knew the answer. Finally he said, "I would have done it for nothing." She looked at him across the fire, and something in her chest resolved itself, like a knot loosening, like a door coming open on its own. She said, "I figured that out." He looked at her then properly, with all of the steadiness and the quietness and the deep attention that she had been accumulating for 2 weeks without being able to name what it was building toward. He said, "I would like to stay, Violet. Not just near the homestead. I would like to stay." She understood what he meant. She said, "I know." He said, "I have not done this well before. The staying." She said, "I know that too." He said, "But I think I have been practicing." She said, "What do you mean?" He said, 2 weeks of waking up and knowing where I was supposed to be. 2 weeks of knowing the right direction." He said it had felt different from anything before. He said it had felt like the difference between moving and going somewhere. She stood up from her place at the fire and came around it slowly and sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. He was very still. She looked at the fire, and so did he. She said, "I think you are already better at staying than you believe." His hand found hers in the dark, beside the fire, and she turned her palm and held on, and neither of them said anything more for a long time. And the sky above the New Mexico mesa country was the most extravagant scattering of stars she had ever seen. And she thought that this was what it felt like when something you had not planned for turned out to be the most important thing that had ever happened to you. They rode into Santa Fe on the 18th day, the town spreading along the base of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in the particular adobe-warm way it had, older than most American cities, layered with Spanish and Pueblo history, alive with the smell of piñon smoke and the sound of 3 languages mixing in the plaza. Violet had never been here before, and she let herself look at it openly, without trying to seem composed. Amos brought them to a good water stop for the horses, and then to a respectable inn where Violet took a room for the night, the first proper bed in nearly 3 weeks. He stayed at a boarding house nearby that he had used before. They agreed to meet the next morning and finish the journey to Clara's homestead. She slept in the bed and found it strange, too soft, too quiet. She lay awake longer than she expected, listening to the town settle into its nighttime sounds, and thinking about a man who had come back from the Colorado border in a hard ride to take a job for half pay. In the morning he was at the inn before she came downstairs. He had fresh bread and fruit from the market at the plaza. He handed her the bread without ceremony, the way he did everything, as though caring for a person were simply part of the natural order of things. She took the bread and said, "Thank you, Amos." He said, "Of course." She said, "Did you sleep?" He said, "Some." She said, "Me too. Just some." He looked at her and she looked at him, and they both knew what the sleeplessness was about, though neither of them said it, because some things at their beginning are too new and too important to press with words. The last 20 miles to Clara's homestead took most of the morning. The land east of Santa Fe was softer than the mesas to the west, greener in the creek valleys, the mountains close and present to the north, and Violet felt herself leaning forward as though she could hurry the wagon by wanting to arrive. Clara came out of the house when she heard the wagon, and she was thinner than Violet remembered, more tired around the eyes, but her face when she saw her sister was the face of a person released from a weight they had been carrying for a very long time. The 2 sisters held each other in the yard for a long moment, not saying anything. The 2 children, a 4-year-old boy named Thomas who was already trying to climb the wagon wheel, and a 2-year-old girl named May who stood in the doorway looking at everything with enormous dark eyes, emerged into the scene gradually, drawn by curiosity. Amos waited at the edge of all this, giving it space. He had unloaded the wagon and stacked things neatly by the house before Clara had finished being shocked and moved by her sister's presence, and when Clara finally noticed him and looked at Violet with a questioning expression, Violet said, "This is Amos Hawkins. He brought me safely across." Clara shook his hand and said she was grateful. He said it was no trouble. Thomas had by this point climbed onto Cedar's back by standing on the fence rail, and Cedar was accepting this with the philosophical patience of a horse who has seen everything. And Amos watched this with amusement and did not say anything about it. Clara's homestead was in a state that told its own story. The house itself was sound, a good adobe structure with thick walls and a proper roof, but the fences needed work, the barn was disorganized, and the small cattle herd, about 30 head, had been running looser than was ideal since the winter. Edmund Fitch had been a competent but not exceptional rancher, and the operation had been sustained by his presence more than his system, which meant that without him, things had begun to drift. Amos said nothing during the first walk around the property, but Violet saw him taking it in, the way he had taken in every piece of landscape since Abilene, with steady, comprehensive attention. That evening, after Clara's children were in bed and the sisters had talked for 2 hours at the kitchen table about everything that needed to be said, Violet found Amos outside by the barn. He was sitting on the fence in the dark, looking out at the cattle, and she came and stood beside the fence and leaned against it. She said, "What do you see?" He said, 31 head, 3 of them calves born this spring. Good grass in the south pasture. The north fence is down in 2 places and needs to be rebuilt before those cattle start wandering. The water situation is manageable from the creek, but someone needs to dig out the stock tank before summer because it is silting up. 2 months of focused work, maybe 3, and this place could run smoothly. She said, "Could you do that work?" He said, "I could do most of it. I would need a hand for some of the fence work. There are men in Santa Fe who hire out by the day." She said Clara has some savings, not a lot, enough for 2 or 3 months. He said that is enough. She looked at him in the dark, the mountains visible even at night against the slightly lighter sky. She said, "Amos," she said, "I need to tell you something." He turned on the fence and looked at her. She said, "I came here for Clara. I came because she needed me and she is my sister and there was nothing else to do." She said that was true and she would not change a word of it. But she said that somewhere between Abilene and the Cimarron River, she had discovered that coming here was also the best decision she had ever made for reasons that had nothing to do with Clara. He got down from the fence and stood in front of her, close, and the moonlight was enough to see his face clearly, everything in it that he had been holding carefully for 18 days. He said, "Violet Langley." She said, "Yes." He said, "I have been in love with you since about the 3rd day." He said it plainly and without apology, the way he said everything true. He said he knew it was fast and he knew it was complicated, given the arrangement they had been in, and he said he had spent the last 2 weeks being very careful about it because she was his responsibility on the trail, and he was not a man who confused those things. But now they were off the trail, he said, and she was not his responsibility in that sense anymore, and he wanted to say it while he still had the nerve. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw and he went very still. She said, "I have been in love with you since approximately the storm at the bluff." He turned his face into her hand slightly, involuntarily, and she saw it and felt it, and it undid her completely in the best possible way. He covered her hand with his and looked at her and said, "What do we do now?" She said, "You are going to stay and fix the north fence and dig out the stock tank." She said Clara needed help, and the children needed stability, and this homestead needed someone who knew what they were doing. She said they were going to figure out the rest of it as they went, the way people always figured out the important things, day by day and without a complete map. He said, "And us." She said, "Us is already figured out." She said, "I am just giving you time to catch up to what I already know." He laughed. A real laugh, not the near smile she had accumulated over 18 days, but an actual full laugh, warm and low and so good to hear that she stored it immediately, the way she stored the things she knew she would want to remember. He said, "You are something else entirely, Violet Langley." She said, "I know." He kissed her then, in the dark beside Clara's fence, with the cattle moving quietly in the south pasture, and the mountains standing over everything like witnesses. And it was a first kiss that felt like something that had already been decided long before either of them had thought to ask the question. The weeks that followed were the best kind of busy. Amos threw himself into the work of the homestead with the same focused competence he brought to everything, and within 3 days he had assessed the full scope of what needed doing, made a list, prioritized it, and begun. He hired 2 men from Santa Fe for the fence work, men he found through careful inquiry at the livery, because he was not a man to trust blindly, and the north fence was rebuilt solid in 4 days of hard work. He dug out the stock tank himself, which was brutal labor in the late spring heat, and Violet brought water and food out to him at midday and watched him work with an uncomplicated admiration. She no longer felt any need to hide. He was extraordinarily capable, and she had always believed that capability in service of something good was genuinely beautiful. He reorganized the barn, which Thomas followed him through for most of the process, asking the ceaseless questions of a 4-year-old, and Amos answered every one of them with patience and directness that made Violet's chest ache pleasantly. He did not talk down to the boy. He explained how things worked. He showed him how to hold a hammer. He let him pass nails. Clara watched all of this with the knowing expression of an older sister who had always said that Violet had too high a standard, but who now clearly felt that it had been entirely justified. One evening Clara said to Violet, when they were washing the dishes, and the children were in bed, and Amos was outside checking on the stock before turning in, she said, "He looks at you the same way Edmund used to look at me." She said it quietly, not with grief exactly, but with the particular tenderness of someone who has had something precious and knows its value. Violet said, "Yes." She said she knew. Clara said, "Do not let it take you too long to do something about it." Violet said she had already done something about it. Clara said, "I mean the permanent something." Violet said, Clara said, "I am serious. He is not a man who will push you. I can see that already. He will wait as long as you need because he is that kind of man. But do not make him wait too long just because you are being careful." Violet thought about this later, after Clara was asleep and the house was quiet. She was not being careful, not exactly. She was savoring. There was a difference, she thought, between caution and savoring, and she was doing the latter, holding each day carefully because she had not expected any of it, and things you have not expected feel fragile until they don't. But Clara was not wrong either. On a Sunday in early June, 7 weeks after they had arrived at the homestead, Amos came in from the south pasture in the early afternoon and found Violet on the porch working on a letter to the school board in Abilene, formally relinquishing her position. He sat down on the step beside her, and she finished the paragraph she was on and set down the pen. He said, "Are you sure about that?" She said, "I have been sure about that since the Cimarron crossing." He said, "Teaching is important work." She said, "So is staying here with Clara and the children until this place is secure." She said there would be schools needing teachers in New Mexico too, when the time was right. He nodded, looking out at the mountains. Then he turned to her and said he had been thinking. He said he wanted to tell her something and then ask her something, and he would rather do it directly than circle around it because he had never been good at circling around things. She said, "Go ahead." He said, "I have been thinking about what staying means." He said he had examined it from every angle he knew how to examine things, and it came back to the same conclusion every time, which was that staying meant choosing something over the open road, and that choosing something over the open road meant the thing had to be worth more than everything the road had ever offered him. He said, "You are worth more." He said, "This place is worth more." He said, "Whatever we would build here together is worth more than every trail I have ever ridden." She looked at him, and she was very still inside, the way you are when something you have been hoping for arrives and is more than you hoped. He said, "Violet Langley, I am asking you to marry me." He said he did not have a ring because he had not been carrying one around, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. He said he had the work of his hands and his knowledge of the land and more love than he had ever known he was capable of, and he said he hoped that was enough. She said, "Of course it is enough." She said yes so simply and with such wholeness that he looked momentarily startled, as though he had prepared himself for more complication. She said, "Amos, I decided this at the Cimarron." I have just been giving you time to catch up." He laughed again, that warm, low laugh, and she thought she would spend 50 years making him laugh and never get tired of it. He pulled her close and she went, and they sat on Clara's porch in the New Mexico sun, with the mountains watching and the cattle moving peacefully in the distance, and everything felt settled in the particular way that real things feel settled, not neat and clean and uncomplicated, but true. Clara found out when she came home from the garden and found them the way they were, and she put down her basket and put her hands on her hips and said, "Finally." Thomas, who was sitting on the top fence rail, said, "What is finally?" May, from the porch steps, said nothing, because she was two and had more important things to do, such as attempting to fit a pinecone into a very small jar. Clara hugged Violet for a long time. She shook Amos's hand and then, because she was Clara, she hugged him too, which clearly surprised him. He stood in it with his arms going around her shoulders somewhat formally, the way a man who is not used to being embraced by people stands when it happens unexpectedly, and Clara laughed at his expression and said, "You had better get used to it." She said, "We hug in this family." He looked at Violet over Clara's shoulder, helpless and happy, and she looked back and thought, yes, this, exactly this. They were married in Santa Fe in July of 1874, in a small ceremony at the church in the Old Plaza, one of the oldest churches in North America, its thick adobe walls and dark, cool interior feeling both ancient and welcoming. Clara stood with Violet and a man named Robert Callie, who worked the ranch adjoining Clara's and had become a decent neighbor and something of a friend to Amos in the weeks of fence building, stood with him. Violet wore the one good dress she had packed in the trunk, a deep blue that her father had always said matched her eyes, though she had always thought that was the kind of flattery fathers were obliged to offer. Amos wore a clean shirt and his good coat, and he had somehow found a barber, because when he came through the church door he was shaved and his hair was cut, and he looked so different and the same that she caught her breath. He saw her and the expression on his face made every other person in the room irrelevant for a moment. The priest spoke in a mixture of Spanish and English, which neither of them minded. The vows were simple. His voice was steady when he spoke them, which she had expected. She had not entirely expected how moved she would be by the steadiness of it, by the fact that he was a man who could be trusted to mean what he said completely. She kept her voice steady too. She had practiced. Afterward they ate in the plaza, at a table outside a small restaurant Clara had found, and Thomas ate enormously and then fell asleep on Robert Callie's shoulder, and May tried to catch a cat and failed repeatedly, and Clara cried a little, quietly, and Violet held her hand, and Amos watched all of it with the expression of a man who is in the middle of something he had not dared to want and is now simply trying to take it all in. He leaned over at one point and said quietly, "I did not know it would feel like this." She said, "Like what?" He said, "Like having a place in the world, like belonging to a map." She said, "You always had a place in the world. You just had not found it yet." He looked at her with such open feeling that she did not even try to deflect it. She just looked back, the way you look at something you have chosen completely. The months that followed were a different kind of journey, one made in place rather than across miles, but no less full of discovery. Amos settled into the work of the homestead, and surrounding it with the same total competence he had brought to everything on the trail. And slowly, under his management and Violet's organization, Clara's operation began not just to stabilize but to grow. The cattle herd expanded. They brought in a good bull in the autumn from a rancher near Albuquerque, and the following spring saw a solid calf crop. Amos built a second corral and a better barn, with help hired from Santa Fe and also from Robert Callie, who proved to be genuinely useful with wood, and whose appearances at the ranch became frequent enough that Clara began to straighten her hair before breakfast on the days he was due. Violet watched this development with considerable satisfaction. Clara deserved good things. She had buried her husband in the cold of a New Mexico winter with 2 children under 5, and had kept going. And the fact that she might find warmth again was a matter of simple justice. She said nothing to Clara about it. She did say something to Amos, who said he had noticed it 2 weeks ago and had already wondered the same thing, and that he liked Robert Callie well enough to think it was not a bad prospect. She said, "Listen to you, evaluating a man's suitability. He said, he is my neighbor. I want to know if he is trustworthy." She said, "And is he?" He said, "I think so." He said, "The way a man treats horses tells you a great deal," and Callie was as careful with his animals as any man Amos had seen. Violet said that was a reasonable standard. In the spring of 1875, approximately 1 year after she had posted a notice in Garrison's general store window in Abilene, Violet discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for a week before she said anything, and when she told Amos, she told him plainly in the way she told him everything, sitting at the kitchen table in the early morning with the coffee between them and the light coming in soft through the window. She said, "We are going to have a child." He was very still for a moment. She could see him receiving it, the news moving through him. Then he reached across the table and took her hand and held it in both of his, and he looked at her, and she saw everything in his face that he had ever held carefully, and all of it was right there, open and unguarded. He said, "Are you well?" She said, "I am very well." He said, "Are you happy?" She said, "Amos." She said, "I am the happiest I have ever been in my life." He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed it there, and she felt his breath against her fingers, and she thought that some moments are so complete that there is nothing to add to them. Clara was delighted and immediately practical, producing opinions about everything from what Violet should eat to the best position for sleeping, all of which she delivered with the authority of a woman who had been through this twice. Thomas wanted to know when the baby would be big enough to ride a horse. May showed no particular opinion on the matter, but seemed agreeable to the general atmosphere of celebration. The months of the pregnancy passed well. New Mexico in 1875 was experiencing a period of relative settlement, the territory beginning to develop more of the infrastructure of civilization, roads improving, towns growing, though it was still very much a place where the old ways and the new were constantly negotiating. Amos navigated all of it with his characteristic competence, expanding the range of his and Violet's homestead, which they had established on a good parcel of land adjacent to Clara's, building a proper house with thick adobe walls the way the local construction wisdom demanded for the desert temperature swings. He built the house himself, with help, learning the adobe technique from a man in Santa Fe who had been working with the material his whole life, a man who charged fair wages and worked with extraordinary skill, and who told Amos that he built like a man who understands that a house is supposed to last. Amos took this as a high compliment, which it was. The house had a deep porch that caught the afternoon shade, 2 good rooms and a kitchen, and a stone fireplace that Amos built with a patience and a perfectionism that Violet watched without comment. She had learned that when he was doing something he wanted to do right, the best thing was to let him work and bring him water. In November of 1875, their son was born. He was born in the house Amos had built, delivered by a midwife from Santa Fe who was experienced and calm, and who told Violet afterward that she had done well. Violet said she was fairly sure it had been the other way around. The midwife laughed. Amos had stayed close through the labor, not in the room for the birth itself, as was the custom, but near, and the midwife reported that he had been at the door approximately every 10 minutes with questions about whether everything was proceeding normally, and that she had told him 4 separate times that yes, it was, and that he should go sit down. He had not sat down. When the midwife brought him in and he saw Violet sitting up in the bed with the baby, the expression on his face was one she held in her memory for the rest of her life. He came across the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and his son looked back with the vague, unfocused attention of the very newly arrived, and Amos put one careful finger against the baby's hand, and the baby's fingers curled around it. He did not say anything for a long time. She watched him hold the baby's gaze in the serious, attentive way he had always watched the world. Then he said, quietly, hello. He said it softly, directly to the baby, as though they were being introduced. She would tell this story to their son one day, and to the children who came after him, and she would always say that it was the moment she understood that Amos Hawkins had been building toward this his entire life without knowing it, that all the miles and the trails and the not knowing how to stay had been the long way around to here. They named him James, after Violet's father. James Hawkins was a contented baby who grew into a cheerful and determined toddler, who followed Amos around the property with a seriousness of purpose that made everyone who saw it laugh. By the time James was 2, he had opinions about horses, which he delivered at length in the limited vocabulary available to a 2-year-old. Amos listened to all of these opinions with a straight face. Thomas, now 6, was James's idol and shadow, and the two boys together constituted a small but effective force of chaos that kept both households on their toes. May, now 4, watched all of this from a position of superior calm, which seemed innate and apparently permanent. Robert Callie proposed to Clara in the spring of 1876, which surprised no one except Clara, who had apparently been convincing herself that she was imagining things. She said yes on the spot and then cried for 20 minutes, and Robert stood in the kitchen looking at Amos over the top of Clara's head with the expression of a man who wants guidance, and Amos said quietly, "This is a good thing." Robert nodded with visible relief. Clara and Robert married in the summer of 1876, a somewhat larger and louder occasion than Violet and Amos's wedding had been, with more neighbors present and considerably more food. Thomas wore his good shirt, and complained about it throughout the ceremony with the thoroughness of a 6-year-old boy who has strong opinions about collars. May was the picture of dignity, which at age 4 she clearly considered her primary occupation. James, not yet a year old, slept through the entire ceremony in Violet's arms, which Violet considered his best contribution to the occasion. The two families lived side by side in adjacent homesteads, their operations increasingly integrated, sharing labor and resources in the practical way of frontier neighbors. It was a good arrangement, built on genuine affection and the kind of mutual respect that comes from knowing people in their ordinary days, in the mundane and the difficult and the occasional sublime, which is to say knowing them as they actually were rather than as they presented themselves. Violet taught. When a school opened in the growing settlement 8 miles east of Santa Fe, she was among the first to put her name forward, and she taught there 3 days a week for years, riding in on a horse she had finally acquired because the wagon was too slow for her purposes. She loved the work. She had always loved the work. She loved the children's faces when something difficult became suddenly clear, the specific delight of comprehension, and she loved the way teaching forced her to keep thinking, to keep examining what she knew and what she did not. Amos came to pick her up from the school sometimes, on afternoons when she had ridden in, and he happened to be coming from that direction anyway, which happened more often than could be entirely accounted for by coincidence. She never pointed this out. She had learned to receive his care the way he had learned to receive hers, openly and without deflection. The schoolchildren were deeply interested in Amos Hawkins. He was tall and quiet in a way that children who have excellent instincts correctly identified as safe rather than cold, and once they had established this, they asked him many questions when he appeared at the school door. He answered them all. He told them about the land, about how to read weather, about the animals of the territory, about the stars, and the ways different peoples used them for navigation. The teacher in him, which he did not know he had, was right there at the surface when children were asking. Violet watched this and thought, as she often thought, about how thoroughly the world would have been poorer if she had said yes to either of the 2 men who had proposed to her in Indiana. In 1877, their daughter was born, a girl with Violet's dark hair and Amos's gray-green eyes, and they named her Ruth. She was a focused, observant child from the beginning, watching everything with the same comprehensive attention her father brought to the world, so that people who met the family often remarked that the daughter had her father's eyes in every sense. James, now nearly 2, examined his sister with scientific interest for the first several weeks and then declared her all right, which was considered high praise from a nearly 2-year-old. The years settled into their pattern, which was not the same as settling into routine, because the territory was never static, always changing, new people arriving, old disputes resolving or not resolving, the slow process of a region finding its shape. Amos was a recognized presence in the valley around Santa Fe, known for his knowledge of the land and his practicality and the particular quality of his word, which when given was kept without exception. He served on the water committee for the Valley Ranchers for 3 years and was asked to serve longer but declined, saying there were younger men who needed the experience. Violet became one of the most respected teachers in the county, a category that was just beginning to organize itself in New Mexico territory, and in 1879 she was asked to help establish a curriculum standard for the new schools being built in the region. She threw herself into this work with the same energy she brought to everything she decided mattered, which was the same energy she had brought to posting that notice in Garrison's general store window 5 years earlier. One evening in the late autumn of 1879, Violet and Amos sat on the deep porch of their house with the last of the day's warmth in the air, and the mountains going purple in the last light, and the sounds of James and Ruth playing somewhere in the direction of Clara's house, the children having migrated in the natural way of children between the 2 neighboring households as long as anyone could remember. She had a letter in her hand from Abilene, a former colleague from the school there, writing to say that the town had grown considerably and asking whether Violet would consider returning as head of the new expanded school. She had read it twice before coming out to the porch. Amos read it once and handed it back. She asked without preamble what he thought. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains. Then he said, "What do you want?" She said, "I am asking what you think." He said, "I think you have built something here that would take years to build anywhere else. I think James knows every horse in the valley by name, and Ruth could find her way home from anywhere within 10 miles by the age of 4. I think your sister is 20 minutes away and her children are our children's closest companions." He said, "I think Santa Fe is where we belong." She said, "You would not want to move." He said, "No." He said, "But not because I could not." He said he had spent 10 years proving he could go anywhere. He said the thing he had learned since was that the bravery was not in moving. The bravery was in choosing a place and building something in it that was worth staying for. She looked at him in the failing light and thought, as she had thought 100 times since a morning in a room at the Drovers Inn in Abilene, that he was a better man than he knew. She said, "I am going to write back and decline." He said, "Are you certain?" She said, "Absolutely." He nodded, and she saw the relief he did not quite cover, small and honest, the relief of a man who had chosen his place and needed it to be chosen back. She wrote the letter that evening and sent it the next morning. She did not regret it. She had examined the life she was living and found it not only sufficient but extravagant, rich in the ways that matter, in love given and received fully, in work that served something real, in children growing into themselves in a landscape that would shape them for life, in a sister nearby and well, in a husband who looked at her still, the way he had looked at her across the fire on the south bank of the Cimarron River, as though she were the most important information the world had ever offered him. In the spring of 1882, Violet and Amos had their 3rd child, a son they named William, after Amos's father, which surprised Amos when she suggested it, and moved him in the way that the unexpected kindnesses always moved him, with a depth he could not immediately speak. William was a different kind of child than his siblings, louder and more immediately sociable, charmed by everything and charming in return, so that Clara said he had clearly gotten all the extraversion that Amos had left on the trail somewhere between Kansas and New Mexico. Amos said he thought that was probably fair. James, at 7, took his role as eldest sibling seriously and had already begun teaching William things with an earnestness that made everyone who witnessed it struggle to keep a straight face. Ruth, at 5, treated William with the affectionate tolerance of a person who knows she is the interesting one in the family and is simply waiting for others to catch up. The homestead had expanded over the years. They had added land twice, sensible purchases at good times, and the cattle operation was not large, but it was well managed and consistently profitable. They employed 2 men permanently, both from the local area, both capable and reliable, and Amos paid them fairly and treated them with respect, and in return had workers who stayed for years rather than the seasonal turnover that plagued some of the larger operations. On the occasion of their 10th wedding anniversary, in the summer of 1884, Clara and Robert organized a gathering that became considerably larger than anyone had planned, which was Clara's specialty as a host. People came from across the valley and from Santa Fe itself, neighbors and colleagues and families whose children had been Violet students, and a few people from even farther who had some connection to the Hawkins or Fitch-Calley operations over the years. Robert Calley gave a toast that was both too long and genuinely moving. Thomas, now 15 and taller than his stepfather, stood at the edge of the gathering and pretended not to be affected by it. May, at 13 and already the most composed person in any room she entered, said the toast was very nice. James, who was 9, ate an extraordinary amount of pie. Ruth, at 7, decided she wanted to give a toast too and stood up before anyone could stop her and said that her parents were the best people she knew and she would like to be like both of them when she was grown. There was a silence after this, and then the kind of applause that is slightly wet around the edges. Amos looked at his daughter with an expression that Violet would describe later as the one he always had when something undid him. The same expression he'd had on the porch at Clara's place when he had asked her to marry him, when James had curled his fingers around Amos's the night he was born, when Violet had declined the job in Abilene. An expression of a man who had spent years on the open road and had arrived, finally, somewhere so thoroughly home that he still sometimes could not quite believe it was real. That night, after the guests were gone and the children were in bed and the house was quiet, and the New Mexico sky was doing its usual extravagant thing with the stars, they sat on the porch again, the 2 of them, with the warmth of the day still in the air and the faint sounds of the cattle moving in the far pasture. She said, 10 years. He said, 10 years. She said, are you happy, Amos? He was quiet for a moment, looking at the sky. Then he turned and looked at her and said, I have been happy since about the 3rd day out of Abilene. He said the preceding 10 years had simply been the confirmation of what he already knew by then. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her and they sat in the familiar silence that was not empty but full, the kind of silence that belongs only to people who have been truly known by each other for a long time. She said, I figured that out, you know. He said, what? She said that you would have done it for nothing, the whole trip, all 18 days. She said, I figured it out that night at the fire when you told me about the pay. But I think I had already known it before that. He said, when? She said, the wheel spoke. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, you noticed that. She said, I notice everything, Amos. You know that? He said, yes. He said, I know. She lifted her head and looked at him and he looked back at her, and she saw everything she had seen by firelight in Indian Territory, and by moonlight beside the Cimarron and in the church in the old Santa Fe Plaza, and in 10 years of mornings and evenings and ordinary days that were the actual substance of a life. She said, I am glad you came to the room at the Drover's Inn. He said, I am glad you turned down the other 3. She said the first one smelled of whiskey. He said, good instincts. She said, I have always had good instincts. He said, yes. He said, you picked me. She laughed, and the laugh went out into the New Mexico night. into the dark and the stars and the smell of pinyon, and the sound of the mountains being ancient and patient in the way they always were. And Amos Hawkins held his wife on their porch and felt the particular peace of a man who has traveled a long way to arrive somewhere worth arriving. And who knows, with the same certainty with which he had always known the land, that he is exactly where he is supposed to be. By the time their youngest child was born in 1886, a second son named Henry, who came into the world with his father's steadiness and his mother's dark eyes, the homestead had become the kind of place that people described when they talked about what a family looked like. James at 11 was already helping with the cattle work in the way of a boy who has inherited his father's understanding of animals and land. Ruth at 9 was already his mother's daughter in the way of a girl who sees everything and forgets nothing. William at 4 was still the most social creature any of them had ever encountered and showed no signs of changing. And Henry, new and small, was held by each of them in turn on the evening of his birth, passed from Amos to James to Ruth to William with the ceremony of a family that understood how to receive something precious. Clara came in the morning and held Henry and said he had the Langley nose, which had always been the distinguishing feature, she said, of every Langley worth knowing. Violet said, "From you that is actually a compliment." Clara said, "Of course it is." She looked at her sister over the baby's head, and her expression was everything that 28 years of sisterhood contained, the grief and the difficulty and the love and the luck, all of it. She said Mama would have loved all of this. Violet said yes. She said, "I think she would have loved him especially." She meant Amos, and Clara knew it, and both of them looked across the room to where Amos was at the doorway talking to Robert, his hand on the doorframe, relaxed and present, and the morning light was on his face, and he looked like a man who had built his life out of real things and was entirely at peace with what he had made. He felt them looking and turned his head and caught Violet's eye, and the look that passed between them was the kind that contains a whole history, a prairie spring and a river crossing, and a fire on the south bank of the Cimarron and 10,000 ordinary mornings, and every extraordinary thing that had happened in between. He crossed the room and sat beside her and looked at Henry in her arms, the newest one, the last piece of the shape they had been building together since a morning in a notice in a store window in Abilene, Kansas, in the spring of 1874. He said, "He is perfect." She said, "They all are." He said, "Yes." And outside, the New Mexico morning was doing what it had done every morning for 10,000 years before them, and would do for 10,000 after. The light coming over the mountains in that particular way that changed every hour if you were paying attention. And Amos Hawkins was always paying attention, and so was Violet, and between the two of them, they did not miss a thing.